No, okay. Hi everyone. Sorry, I just was outside with my 3-year-old. He was playing, so just lost track of time. But anyways, tonight we're going to talk about small space gardening. This is great if you have a patio or just like a tiny yard. Like I live in town and my yard is teeny tiny. So this is a great place. We get this a lot in Atlanta. Most people don't have like huge, acre-sized lots or anything. So a good topic if you are looking to either spruce up your patio or your tiny yard or something like that. If you have questions, Yanni's going to be watching the chat box, so she can either interrupt me if it's like time sensitive, or if we can wait till the end, that's fine too. So,
Yes.
all right. So, small space, urban areas, like I said, you don't always have a yard. It's good for a patio. Maybe you even want to update a porch or add some color to your yard. One good thing is it's a little low cost. You're not landscaping a large area. Good for growing some small crops. Easy to move and don't need as much. What is that thing? Hold on, let me move this. Don't need as much soil. So, all right. So you can, in small spaces, you can do vegetables, plants. You can change up your stuff for the season. It's also good for people with maybe some special needs or seniors who aren't really as mobile as much as they used to be, or even anybody at that age. So a lot of people think if they all they can do is containers, they can't grow vegetables. That's not true. You can grow many vegetables in containers and some fruits. Right here, this is example of potatoes. Now this is like a very fancy um, container for growing potatoes. If you're interested in potatoes, they needed to have started in March, but you can still do them right now. Instead of this nice fancy like teak made of cedar container, you could always just use a trash can, like one of the plastic ones, one of the large, taller ones. Drill some holes in the bottom so it can drain, and you put your potatoes in like that. It's best to start them from like slips, not necessarily like a potato you would buy at the grocery store. You put them in the bottom, eye up, cover them with soil. As the leafy green stuff starts to grow up, you cover them, you keep covering them. It's like a layer type thing. And then when all this greenery at the top starts to die down, then you can pour it out and then you'll have all your potatoes. Now, this is good for like red potatoes, your yellow potatoes, Irish potatoes. Your sweet potatoes grow on the ground, on top of the ground, very differently. But if you're interested in these type of potatoes, this is what it looks like.
One quick question. What size containers for potatoes?
So it doesn't have to be like the huge trash can you get from the county, but it needs to be a tall kitchen size trash can. You know what I'm saying? I don't know the gallon size exactly, but one of the taller ones so you can do that layering technique. That would go, I don't know, 3 feet, 4 feet high or so. Does that answer the question? I hope.
Yes.
All right. All right, what vegetables can I grow? So in fall and winter, that you can do a lot in fall and winter, especially your cabbages, kales, lettuces, carrots, radishes, collards, scallions. You can do some herbs inside in the winter. In spring and summer, I prefer to actually grow my tomatoes and peppers in containers over in a raised bed. Okra, beans, onions, are also herbs too. What do you need for vegetables? You need a large container with drainage holes. So it doesn't have to be huge, but it needs to be, I would say, about 12 inches in diameter most of the time. You can use potting soil or potting mix. Fertilizer, we'll go over that. And then most of your summer vegetables need at least 6 hours of sunlight. And containers do tend to dry out easier than, say, a raised bed or something. So you're going to need to water possibly more frequently. Okay, so some fall and winter veggies, cabbage. You can plant that August through September, and then again January through March. So it takes a while. We're kind of out of the fall and winter vegetables right now. Same with kale. Kale is still that trendy food that a lot of people love to grow. Lettuce. So I know a lot of people that still say they grow lettuce in the summer. I don't know how well it does. I would say if you are going to grow lettuce, it needs to be shaded for a good portion of the day. So if you had a taller crop like okra and it was getting that hot afternoon sun, and then so if you got the west sun and lettuce was planted to the east of that okra, it might do well. So it's not going to get that hot afternoon sun. That's also something to think about though when you are planting your crops. If you have kale in a container right here, and then you have, let's say, I don't know, tomatoes right on the east side of it. Those tomatoes need that sun too. So you'd rather be better putting them side by side. Does that make sense? Or am I confusing you? So carrots, we're out of carrot season, but they can do great in containers. A lot of your root crops, radishes, perfect in containers. You could still grow radishes right now. I know it says April 1st, but we're still doing good with radishes. Collards, cauliflower. I'm just going to breeze through these pretty quickly. And then your scallions, green onions, broccoli. Broccoli is really, I plant it, get the best results when I plant that in August. All right, peas. Now there are some summer peas. Your English garden peas, though, you cannot plant them until January. They like it cold, cold, cold. So spinach. All right, and Swiss chard. I've seen Swiss chard grow all the way into June. So if you are interested in that, it could probably be done too. All right, so spring, summer, tomatoes. Why I said that I love tomatoes in containers is because tomatoes are very susceptible to diseases and insects. So if I do it in containers, and I'm starting new with fresh soil every year, so I know that I'm not going to have any disease or any insects that overwintered in the soil. So I prefer my tomatoes and peppers in that. So tomatoes, many different varieties. You want to make sure you can trellis or cage them. Determinate ones are going to give you tomatoes all at one time. So those are good if you want to like grow Romas or something that are good for making sauce out of. Indeterminate will provide you tomatoes all summer long. That's mostly what most people want to grow is the indeterminate ones. They can put on sandwiches and salads and things like that. Be sure to plant them deeply. Again, I said a container that's 12 inches or more in diameter. Make sure there are holes on the bottom so it will drain, and you need to water more frequently. Most of the time, tomatoes in containers are going to dry out almost every day. So unless we had, like, of course, the big rainfall or something. So you want to be around, or if you're going to go on vacation, see if you can set up somebody to help water your tomatoes. When I say plant them deeply, so that first set of leaves on the bottom close to the soil, you're going to want to make sure those are under the soil. So you want to plant that first 1 or 2, 3 even set of leaves are going to be buried in the soil. So, and that's because they will send roots from that plant and it helps anchor them also from the wind. So peppers.
Oh, sorry, we have a quick question here. So they growing vegetables, but they have the problem the animals actually eating the fruits. If they cover the vegetable, is that helpful to prevent it from like eating fruits like squirrels, birds, things like that?
What are they covering it with per se?
Like any recommendations?
Oh, okay. So I was a little worried about that because my backyard seems to be like a squirrel sanctuary back here. I feel like everybody thinks that. If you get chicken wire or even like that hardware cloth rabbit wire, which is just the teeny tiny little squares, and you kind of put it around it, like you're gonna have to have some space for this. Wrap it around it, not touching the containers, almost like a little fence around it, and then over. That can help keep them out. The only thing is tomatoes get pretty tall. So I did this before. It's like kind of put this like semicircle thing around it and it kept them out. And I only did that one season, and for some reason they kind of stayed away after that too. I don't know. But if you get the hardware cloth or rabbit wire, as people call it, they cannot get to them. With chicken wire, squirrels especially can reach their little paws in and still get it. And it's like they know when they're ripe and that's when they want to do it. Another thing that I like to do is when they just get a tinge of orange, just a tinge, I will bring them inside and they'll ripen inside. So if you let them stay on the vine and they get nice and red, then it's like, ooh, it's like a flashing light to them. Let me go take a bite of it and throw it out. But if you get a tinge of orange and you make sure you harvest them then and then put them like in a windowsill or something or in your kitchen, they will ripen inside. So that's my recommendation to try to combat the squirrels or any other critters. You shouldn't have to worry about rabbits or anything if they're in a container because they can't, hop into the container. But squirrels, chipmunks, things like that, they can get to them. But if you wrap almost like fence around it, not touching the container, but close to it, and then put something on top, now you might have to take the top part off of it as they start to grow. So that's the best recommendations I have. We get this question every year. There's just not a whole lot you can do. They tend to not bother your peppers after they've taken a bite out of that and they have a hot mouth. They'll leave those alone. So peppers, they do really well. They can tolerate the heat. They can tolerate drought really well. It's like, hot peppers. They love it. We do recommend that you grow tomatoes and peppers from transplants. You can start them from seed. It just takes a practice almost to start them from seed and get them sturdy enough to take the conditions outside. So if you're a new gardener, I would recommend just buying the transplants. And what I mean is those baby plants about this big that you can find at the garden centers. All right, okra. Okra is a very large plant. I don't know if this container that this lady has, it will actually grow okra. It's growing right there. But it will produce okra all summer long. Usually one plant is enough to feed a small family. Once it starts producing, though, it will spit out okra like every day. So be sure that you're there to harvest it, because if they get too long, then they're tough and you can't eat them. You want to pick them when they're nice and small. So onions, so instead of just you can buy these, I call them baby onions. They're called like onion slips too at the store. Pretty easy to grow. They kind of like a little bit more of a sandier soil. So if you can add some like fine compost or some builder sand in there, you don't have to, but they kind of tend to like it because it helps them drain real well. It does take a longer time for them to grow, but they almost like pop up out of the ground when they're ready. As you can see, you can start to see the tops of these red onions, and they're relatively easy. As long as you have a big enough container, you can do onions pretty well. Beans, one of the easiest vegetables to grow. I like to do these with kids because it's pretty foolproof. Many different varieties. That's also fun, is to show them beans that are purple or red or yellow or whatever. Bush beans, even though they're the small, more compact type, you might also want to maybe put something around them, a little cage. The pole beans, obviously you need something for them to grow up. So herbs. You can grow herbs year-round, indoors and outside. Very easy to grow in containers. They're a great addition to your vegetables, because then once you grow your vegetables, you can then flavor something what you're cooking with your herbs. So starting your herb garden container, it doesn't have to be huge, but the more space you get it with a container, the better they'll probably do. A lot of people prefer terracotta. And part of that is herbs are from the Mediterranean. They don't like to stay wet. So the terracotta kind of like wicks a lot of the moisture away from it. I would recommend that you add some sand to the soil, or perlite or vermiculite or something, or really fine compost so it drains really well. You don't want them to stay soggy and just like your regular potting soil. You want it to drain very well. So these love sun basil. Basil is an annual though. Most likely you will have to buy this plant every year. So it completes its life cycle in 1 year. It's not perennials like a lot of them, so it will not come back. So if your basil died, you didn't do anything to it. That's just its natural progression. Now, rosemary, that will get very large. So if you love rosemary, you can buy a bigger container and keep that. It does kind of die back in the winter, but it will come back. A lot of these, they're perennials. They do kind of look in the wintertime, but then they'll spring back to life in the spring. So the mints, though, you want to keep these separated because let's say you get like a huge, I don't know, whiskey barrel and you want to put all your herbs in that. Don't put your mint in with that because mint is it spreads. It will take over an entire thing, a raised bed, whatever it is. So keep your mints in a container. If you have a raised bed and you want your mint in your herb garden bed, I would say put it in a container and like just bury the container because it will spread. It will take over. Oregano, thyme, lavender, all good herbs. I am trying dill this year. We'll see how well it goes. Some that don't mind some shade are coriander, dill, chives, and tarragon. Dill, sometimes it's just the humidity that doesn't do super well with it. So we'll see how it goes. But I love dill. All right, caring for herbs, use fertilizers sparingly. They don't need a lot. I've seen some herb fertilizers and I think the numbers, if you've ever looked at any sort of fertilizer and it has 3 numbers, that stands for the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And most of them are a general 10, 10, 10. Herb fertilizer was like a 4, 4, 4, if that makes any sense to you all. Too much fertilizer can make them grow large but lose their flavor. Slow release fertilizer is a great option. If you see that Osmocote stuff in those tiny little brown balls, I guess you call them, that's Osmocote. Basil tends to want to shoot up. It will grow very tall. So if you want to trim them at the beginning to give them more of a bushier effect, you can do that. And again, only water them when they feel dry to the touch because they don't want to stay wet. All right, any questions about vegetables or herbs?
Yeah, we do have one questions about herb. When do you trim your lavender?
When do I what? Trim it?
Trim,
Oh, I don't ever trim mine. So, I mean, I guess you could when it starts to grow up, but I tend not to trim it because then you're going to get the actual flower pods at the top. I don't know. I don't do it. Maybe you can. I haven't heard that, but.
Okay. And we have okra plant in a container last year, never really got more than 1 or 2 okra. Any idea what's the problem might be?
Did it get enough sunlight? One thing, they need the hot sun. And also fertilizer. Did you fertilize it at all? Most vegetables need to be fertilized about every 4 to 6 weeks. So that could be an issue. I don't know.
Okay, and for
go ahead.
For beginners, what would be a good recommendation to start now? Any plant combinations or any plants they can start now, easier for beginners?
I mean, most of the ones I went over are pretty easy. It's just like tomatoes are a little more time intensive and they do tend to get diseases and things like that. Beans, radishes, peppers, most of those are relatively easy. Now, peppers and beans and things are relatively pest-free, disease-free. I mean, things can happen, but I would say they're easy. Tomatoes, I would try them. A lot of times towards the end of summer when it starts getting like late August, September, they're just kind of and not doing real well, but I would always try them. So especially if you want to do them in a container. Now, if you're talking about like an actual garden bed, when you start doing your squash and cucumbers and things, then there's like a whole host of insects and diseases and things that they can get. So, all right. So, any other questions, Johnny, or we're good?
So we have, every time I grow tomatoes, they seem to burst.
Okay, so at the top of the tomatoes, a lot of times they will split open, and that is caused by uneven watering. And it's not necessarily the uneven watering that you're doing. It can be from, it rained a lot last summer, so you can't really control how much rainfall it's getting. So a lot of times the tops will kind of split open near where the stem is. Usually if that happens, the tomato is fine. I just cut that off and throw that in the trash, but the rest of the tomato is perfectly fine. It doesn't mean that you need to throw them out or they're diseased or anything. They just kind of split open at the top. It's completely by uneven watering. So,
Okay, what kind of containers do you recommend for growing vegetables?
I just do a lot of the plastic ones. Just make sure they have holes in the bottom. Now, sometimes if it's like a really aggressive tomato, they can crack that container. So if you want to do some of those that look like clay but they're not clay, they're like made of some resin material, those do well too. It doesn't have to be anything specialty or anything like that.
Okay, you will cover the pest management in the later part of this talk, right?
I didn't include it in that, but if they have pest questions, I can definitely go over them.
Yeah, so probably we can do that like at the end of this talk, you
Yeah,
think? Okay.
yeah, because I didn't make the whole presentation just about vegetables, so yeah.
Yeah, okay.
All right, so we're also going to talk about plants in containers. I love, like, in the springtime when it gets warmer, and they put all the pretty flowers out. This is one of my favorite times of year because I get to go and plant my containers. So this is also something you can do. You might not be interested in vegetables, so you're just interested in the flowers. So one thing about containers is it a good container usually has different heights, colors, textures to make it a little more interesting. So this one to the right, if you can see, there's different colors. It's a perfect shade container because these plants like shade. So if you have a shady porch or patio or outdoor area, you can still have nice containers. This one has ferns, the stuff hanging down. They have some ivy, that's asparagus fern. They also have some heucheras in there, that's the red plant. And this just has lots of different textures, heights, some that are going right up, some that are spilling over, some that are just filling it in. It's a nice looking container, very full too. So also, you can also take your containers from summer to fall. If you see right here, this is a type of fountain grass growing very pretty in the summertime. And then they kind of let it die, not die, I guess. You know, we it is kind of dying. But anyways, they used it for their fall harvest looking containers right there. So you just, when you plant them in the summer, think about, okay, would this be visually interesting for me in the fall also? And it is. That fountain grass looks great with their their pumpkins and things like that in the fall. So they obviously just took this, I don't know if that's verbena in there maybe, and sweet potato vine, and then they just replaced it with pumpkins, and looks nice. All right. Some of the newest, trendiest stuff, you can see them all over now, would be the succulents. Also, air plants. If you go to some garden centers, there's air plants everywhere. This is great because air plants, they don't really need soil. They don't need anything. You do want to maybe once a week just dunk them in water to give them like a little bit, let them dry, and then put them back in their container, or you can mist them like once a week or so. Succulents, they love the heat, whatever. Now they're not going to do well in the winter. So if you really love your succulents, you might want to bring them inside because they like it obviously hot and warm. So If you don't have a lot of space, you can grow up if short on space. This is a planting wall at a garden. And then this company is here in Atlanta. It's called Farm Up. And this is kind of like a hydroponics type thing, these towers where you can grow things on those. I don't know a whole lot about hydroponics. I did it many years ago, but a lot of people like it. So. All right. So besides your vegetables, you can do annuals, bulbs, perennials, small shrubs, small trees, even some vines in your containers. Spring and summer, fall, winter, easy to change out, only one growing season. So if you plant stuff this spring and you're like, I don't really like it, hey, well, it's going to be done by the time October, November rolls around, and then you can choose something different for next year. One thing it's good for is it adds instant color. So say your landscape is all just green and you want some color, you can put some containers out on your patio and add some color. Many that are many annuals to pick from. If you have a sunny porch or patio, you want to choose annuals. So that takes sun. We set up some master gardener tables at some of the bigger garden centers in Atlanta. And a lot of time we just realize that people don't even look at the tag. They just are like, oh, that's pretty, I want it. So we'll just be like, hey, do you have a lot of sun? And they'll be like, no. And I'm like, well, that is probably not the best plant for you because that one's like full sun all day. So why don't we go over here to the shaded section and get something right there? And it's just something so simple as that. A lot of people who haven't, they don't know much about gardening and they just pick out what looks pretty to them, and then they die and they don't understand. And it's because you need to get something that's going to fit your landscape. So if you have a lot of sun and, these 4 plants would be great. They're spring, summer plants. Petunias are great. Lantana, that will come back almost every year if you get this Miss Huff type. It is very, very hardy. Gomphrena, I love these. They remind me of like a Dr. Seuss type scene. I actually have some of those in my backyard. Celosia, I love these too. So these can take the sun and the heat very well. Some fall and winter annuals, violas, pansies, Dusty Miller. Dusty Miller will also grow in the summer too. It's a nice accent plant. Some winter, early spring annuals. So this February-ish, I needed my pansies were kind of getting and I just wanted a bright pop of color. So I went and got some primrose and it did the job perfectly. They come in all these different colors. They're very pretty. Snapdragons, same thing. If you want a porch refresh in say February, these are great for that. There's also ornamental vegetables. You can't eat these, but they're ornamental ones for your garden. They have these peppers. The one in the top right reminds me of Christmas lights. I like that one. This is called chili, I think. Chili something or another, Chilly. The hot peppers down in the bottom. And then in the middle, that is a sweet potato vine. I like it because it's like this nice limey green and it looks great. I have sweet potato vines in a nice black container so it pops against each other. So these are not for eating though, just for, nice ornamentals. Same with the winter ones. You can have your cabbages and kales for your containers in the winter. Now bulbs do great in containers, especially because most bulbs or tulips specifically, will not come back in Atlanta. It just doesn't get cold enough for them. They need a nice, very good cold period for them. So I usually keep mine in the garage. I used to keep them in the utility closet when I lived in the condo. And then I would put them in hanging baskets in January, and then they would sprout up and they looked beautiful. So you can always plant them in November, which is when they recommend we plant all of our spring flowering bulbs. but they do great in containers too. You can even layer them to get different ones to bloom at different times. So you can see here on the lower left, they look like daffodils down at the bottom. And I don't know, this could be something, I'm not sure what it is at the top, but you can see on the right, they have a container with different things in it, and they have their tulips popping up, some crocus, some daffodils, all different types of bulbs, hyacinths that you can plant. All right, perennials, these come back year after year. You're great to mix in with your annuals. This is a shade container. They have a hosta. I love this type of hosta. It has a very nice color. Heuchera, astilbe, caryopsis. So lots of different things in this container. Height, textures, colors, everything. Small shrubs, these are great. They can give you more of a landscapey feel, especially if you don't have a yard or anything. They do require larger containers. So on the right, this is, oh my God, it's escaping me. Lemon cypress. I have these in my containers on the right, the one on picture on the right. I love them, love them. They do really well in containers. They have this bright neon limey color to them. And then I just change out the annuals around them every year. You can even grow some trees in the containers. This is some type of cherry. Japanese maples, lemons do great in containers, as well as different evergreens, topiaries, things like that. Vines. Okay, so when you think of vines, you think of them growing out of the ground. Some of them can grow out of a container, or even like a box that you build. They're great for privacy. They can add some interest to your porch or patio. Now, this is something that we see every spring. This is wisteria. It's not the native wisteria. It's Japanese, Chinese wisteria. This is an invasive plant. Now it looks pretty, but it is invasive. It can actually, if it gets big enough, it can take down an entire like wooden structure. I've seen it do this at the gardens where I went to college. It took down like some beams on a bridge. And also the bees love it. So if you have little kids around who are like running around scared because the bees are everywhere, which you could do an important lesson that we like the bees, they're good for us, but that's what this will do. So just be mindful of that. Now there is a native wisteria, which is not quite as aggressive if you would like one. There's trumpet vine. Now the top left is mandevilla. I love this stuff. I grow it in a couple different places in my yard. Clematis is another one. Now the mandevilla will not come back every year, but the other two will. If you're an advanced gardener, you can do this espalier. It's very pretty. I've seen it at some estates. I don't have the space for it, but it's just nice, interesting looking. A lot of people do it with pear trees and some fruit trees because they seem to be a little more bendable when you get them as a young plant, and they do this with them. Fairy gardens, these are great. I mean, they're just fun and whimsical. Kids love them. So if you have a container and you want to do something, you can do a fairy garden. This one, they took an old bird bath and did this whole little garden. So it's something else you can do. All right, so gardening on your patio and porch can have its challenges because of space. However, you can totally revamp the space. And look at this, between two, like a shed and their house, so small, but it looks just so nice to sit out there, and they just put things in containers and take advantage of the height. Hanging pots are great, especially if you have stuff spilling over them. That's one of my favorites. This one didn't have a lot of money to just buy all these fancy containers. So these are just Rubbermaid containers, and they put some trellis behind them, and look at everything that they have growing up. So if you could do that in that large of a container, you could grow your squash, your cucumbers, all that, those kind of things. So
Get the
All right.
trash. Put the trash can up.
All right, so that was it. Do y'all have questions for me?
Yes, I think the previous question is about like the pest management. I think
Okay.
there's one participant asking about the spider mites.
Okay, so spider mites, pretty common. They're pretty easy to control. You can use neem oil that kind of like suffocates them. Also, insecticidal soap will get rid of them too. They're they're relatively easy to control as long as you can apply something to them. So, any other specific pest?
So do you know any like other common pests you have ever met in your container gardens? And do you have like a general ways to control like insect pests in a container garden?
Aphids are pretty common. Again, insecticidal soap, horticultural oils. You can sometimes if it's not bad, you can just spray them off with like a water hose, like blast the plant with them. I got some ladybugs and just dumped them all over my tomato plants, and they actually ate all the aphids. If you're interested in that, so when you see your ladybugs, keep them around. They're a nice beneficial insect that prey on aphids and pests like that. You know, a lot of times with vegetables, when you get the insect pest and things, it's because people have what I call like a dirty garden. And that's because they let old leaves and, you know, they let things fall on the ground, and it's just like a lot of debris by the soil. And that's like a breeding ground for diseases, for insects, things like that. So if you keep your garden clean, you kind of inspect it every day, stay on top of it. Then you tend to be okay. Now, sometimes things happen. Squash bugs come in, squash vine borers, things like that. That happens. But if you're growing your vegetables in containers, the benefit of that is you're not going to have any insects that are living in those containers over the winter, and the diseases aren't going to stay in there if you start with new, fresh soil every summer or every spring or even in the fall too. What?
So the next question is growing lemon tree. So do you have any tips on growing lemon tree in containers? I just purchased a lemon tree, wondered if you have any tips because I don't plan to plant it in the ground, but want to be a container tree.
Yeah, so lemons, because it gets so cold, not cold, but it gets relatively cold here in the wintertime, you want to put it in containers so you can bring it in and out. So definitely bring it indoors. And when it starts to get cold, I'm really bad. I totally neglect my Meyer lemon, and it seems to bloom every year. I do give it like a shot of fertilizer like once or twice in the summer. Just make sure it gets full sun, and it tends to do fine. So I'm bad about mine. I'm like totally neglect it, but it does well. So I don't think there's any super special care with the lemons. So
okay. So the next question is about growing peonies. Can you review growing peonies in containers again, please?
I didn't put peonies in my presentation, but they like some, I would say, some part sun. So if you have a large container, I know most of them are blooming now. My neighbor actually got one and asked me to find a space in her yard for it. Put it in some nice soil, a large container, give it some part sun during the day, and they will do pretty well. So.
Okay. The next one, put my peace lily on patio. Pollen saturated leaves. Now they are showing yellow and brown tips.
I don't know if that's from the pollen. That could be because peace lilies are, well, if it's on a covered patio, it might do okay, but they're not going to want like some intense sun or heat. They are more of an indoor plant. So they tend to also, a lot of thing about house plants is once you get them and you put them in their spot, then if you move them around, they don't like it. They kind of like to stay in the same place. So I have noticed that a lot with my houseplants. I moved houses and they were like on protest against me until they got acclimated to their new space. So if you put them on a porch and they're covered with shade, they should do fine. But if they get any sort of like sun or heat a lot, they might not do well.
Okay. The next question is about watermelon seeds. I saved my watermelon seeds from last year in the fridge. Can I plant them and how?
If you grew your watermelon, then those seeds might be good. If you just bought a watermelon, they might not be good. You would just plant them directly if you have the space, like in a raised bed or just a garden plot. You kind of want to put a little mound, like a little hill type thing, and put the seeds right there, and they'll just grow on top of the ground. They do need full sun. Once the watermelons form, you kind of want to prop them up off the ground. You can't, if you can, to eliminate some of the pests boring into them. But if you bought the watermelon, sometimes a lot of the fruits and vegetables that we consume have been treated with things and they're not viable to plant again. That's why we're like, don't buy a potato at the store and then try to grow potatoes from it. You need to get the little slips and things.
Yeah, and I also think there is one experiment like you can do to test if your seeds are still usable or they can germinate is you can use a bottle of water and put your seeds in the water for like 7 hours or so. If the seeds is kind of like floating on the surface of the water, that portion of the seeds already probably empty, and even if you just like sowing them in the seeds, they wouldn't germinate. I think I saw that experiment. Okay.
So yeah, you can look that up. It's like a floating test too. So
yeah. So the next question is about patio eggplant growing tips.
I mean, eggplant doesn't need a whole lot of space. I've never thought about actually growing. I don't really like eggplant. I know I should have put it in there. As long as it gets the full sun, it should be okay, and you can get it in a large enough container. Then it's relatively pest free too. So.
Okay. So next question: when can I cut back the stems of my spanned daffodils?
Okay, so they say you want to wait until they turn brown and then you cut them. I hated the look of them, so I just waited till like last week and I just cut mine down. And I've never had an issue without my daffodils coming back. So they recommend that you want them to die completely down, so all those nutrients go into your daffodil bulbs. But if you're like me and you got tired of the leaves, you can cut them down now and they still come back every year. That is Sarah telling you what she does, not the extension agent would tell you to wait until they die down so they get as most nutrients as possible.